The night seemed endless as Quinn Ashford drove along the highway, the rhythmic hum of his car tires on the asphalt blending with the steady beat of his anxious heart. It had been a tough few months for him, a stressful job, a painful breakup, the weight of decisions he couldn't seem to get right. His mind was clouded, filled with thoughts he couldn't shake. So, when he noticed the road stretching before him, he took the detour without thinking. Maybe he could clear his head. Maybe the quiet would help. But this road, it didn't feel right. First, it had seemed harmless, a narrow road winding between thick trees that loomed like sentinels in the dark. No streetlights, no signs, just the soft glow of his headlights cutting through the inky blackness. Yet, the longer he drove, the more he realized something was off. The road stretched on endlessly, like it was too perfect, too straight. And there was something strange about the air. It felt thick, oppressive, like something was suffocating the night. The trees seemed to hover unnaturally close, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky, their shadows sharp against the pale light. But what unnerved him the most was the silence. No chirping of insects, no rustle of wind in the trees. It was as if the world had frozen in time. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He glanced at his GPS. No signal, no indication of where he was, what he was driving toward. The road wasn't on any map. He tried to ignore the unease gnawing at him, trying to focus on the road ahead. The faint outlines of the trees blurred in his peripheral vision. But there was something pulling him forward, an invisible force urging him deeper into the unknown, into the dark. He felt it, that sinking sensation deep in his gut, the one that whispered something wasn't right, that he should turn back, but his hands didn't obey. The car moved on, drawn by something he couldn't explain. It was then that he saw him, standing at the side of the road, a figure, barely more than a silhouette shrouded in darkness. The man didn't move, didn't react as Quinn's headlights passed over him. But as Quinn slowed down, something tugged at his chest, his breath catching in his throat. There was something about the way the man stood there, too still, too lifeless. His face was obscured by shadows, his posture unnervingly rigid. Quinn slowed to a crawl, curiosity battling the rising dread in his chest. It wasn't until he came to a complete stop that the man spoke, his voice a low rasp that seemed to slip out of the darkness itself. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It sent a cold shiver running up Quinn's spine. "The rules are different here. Follow them, or it will find you." Quinn's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the door handle. But the man's voice stopped him in his tracks. It was commanding, like a warning that carried more weight than any threat he'd ever heard. "Who are you?" Quinn managed, his voice shaking despite himself. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his face still hidden, his eyes locked on Quinn with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But before Quinn could ask another question, the man disappeared, vanishing into the night as though he had never been there at all. Quinn sat there for a moment, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Or was he just losing his mind from the stress? But there was something about the way the man had spoken, the weight in his voice, that made Quinn's stomach churn. He shook his head, trying to focus. "It's just a man on the side of the road. People do strange things out here," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. But even as he spoke, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He glanced at his rearview mirror, half expecting the man to be there, staring back at him, but the road was empty. Nothing but the endless stretch of darkness. Quinn took a deep breath and pressed the gas pedal, convincing himself that he had just imagined the whole thing. But the further he went, the stranger things began to feel. The trees, once static, now seemed to move ever so slightly. They swayed, their branches reaching in odd, unnatural ways, as if the wind was urging them to close in on him. The shadows stretched too long. The world outside felt unreal. The headlights of his car flickered, casting eerie shadows on the road, and his mind raced. The silence had grown deeper, more suffocating, and he swore he could hear a faint whisper on the wind. "Turn back, turn back, turn back." The words echoed, but when he looked around, there was no one. No sign of movement. He pressed on, ignoring the rising panic in his chest. He had to be imagining things. The road was just strange, that's all. He told himself it was nothing. But the deeper he went, the more the world around him seemed to distort. Figures, barely human, translucent, like ghosts, flashed at the edges of his vision, darting in and out of the trees. Every time he turned his head to look, they vanished, but the feeling lingered. Quinn's fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The eerie quiet settled over him like a blanket, stifling. His breath quickened, his heart racing. It felt as though something was following him, just beyond the veil of the darkness. A presence, something ancient and malevolent, lurking just out of sight. He had to get out. He had to leave. But the road didn't end. It stretched on, twisting, bending, as if mocking him. He glanced at his GPS again, desperate for any sign of normality, but it was still blank, a void. There was nothing. He was lost. His grip tightened. His eyes darted nervously around the car, half expecting to see something move, to see the man, the Watcher, standing just outside the window. But when he looked again, there was nothing, just the endless, empty road. And then the road ahead shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight bend. But as he drove, it became more pronounced. He was no longer on the road he had started on. The turn had come out of nowhere, a sharp curve, leading him into an unfamiliar stretch. His chest tightened with anxiety as he scanned the trees. This wasn't the road he had been on before. He hadn't seen any signs of a turn, hadn't remembered any junctions. How had he ended up here? Quinn slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt. He whipped his head around to look behind him, expecting to see the familiar stretch of road he had come from, but it was gone. The trees had shifted, the landscape had changed, as though the road itself had swallowed his past path, erasing it. The road ahead twisted again, further than before, and Quinn's heart thudded in his chest. That's when he noticed it, the Watcher. But this time he wasn't on the side of the road. He was standing in the middle of the path ahead, his figure looming like a shadow. His face was still obscured, his body unmoving, but Quinn could feel it, an intense pressing weight in the air, as though something was watching him through the Watcher's very presence. Quinn's mind raced. He had to turn back. This was wrong. This was all wrong, but the road was already shifting, changing. There was no turning back, no escape. The Watcher's voice cut through the silence again. "You've crossed the line," he said, his voice somehow louder now, clearer. "You've made a choice. There's no way back." Quinn's eyes widened as the road in front of him began to darken, the trees closing in on him, and the whispers grew louder, filling his mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, everything went still. The road ahead stretched on like an endless ribbon of dark asphalt, each curve and bend a mystery. Quinn had already driven for hours, but the scenery around him remained eerily the same. The trees, tall and twisted, seemed to encroach on the road, their branches clawing at the sky as if trying to pull him into the thick shadows. The air was oppressive, heavy with something Quinn couldn't quite put his finger on. His mind raced, every passing minute making his stomach churn. This place, it didn't feel like the world he knew. It felt wrong. but he couldn't turn back now. As he drove, his eyes kept darting to the side of the road where things seemed off, strange shapes in the distance that didn't belong. There was an old rusted car on the shoulder, the windows shattered, the doors hanging open as if someone had abandoned it in a hurry. Quinn shuddered, but kept driving. A flicker of light caught his eye next, a streetlight that blinked like it was struggling to stay on. The yellowish glow cast long, warped shadows on the road, making everything feel even more distorted. Then he saw it, something that made his heart skip a beat. A sign, nailed to a crooked post at the side of the road. The words were faded, barely legible, but Quinn could make them out. Rule 1. Never stop. If you stop, it will come for you. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, a cold sweat forming on his brow. The words felt like a warning, but they made no sense. What was he supposed to do? Keep driving? What was it? And why did he feel like the road was playing tricks on him? Quinn tried to shake off the feeling creeping into his chest. It's just a weird sign, he muttered to himself. People put up stupid stuff all the time. But the unease didn't go away. It settled deeper, gnawing at him, whispering that something terrible was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. The road stretched on, the same quiet, suffocating silence pressing in around him. Quinn felt like he was in a world out of place. No signs of life, no towns, no animals. Nothing but the endless expanse of trees and dark sky. His headlights barely made a dent in the heavy darkness. He felt more isolated with every passing mile, more trapped. Suddenly in the distance, he saw a figure, a woman standing just off the side of the road. Her clothes were old, worn, like they had been through years of harsh weather. She seemed out of place, like she didn't belong to this world. Quinn slowed his car. His curiosity piqued. As he came closer, he could see her face, pale, drawn, her eyes hollow, staring at the ground as if lost in thought. She didn't look up when Quinn stopped the car, but something about her made his heart pound in his chest. He rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaky. The woman lifted her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his with a sad, knowing look. "I'm stuck," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been here for too long." Quinn's stomach churned. "Stuck? What do you mean?" Her gaze never wavered, but her words felt heavy, like they carried a weight Quinn couldn't understand. "This road, it doesn't let people leave. I've been here for years. If you're not careful, it will trap you too." Quinn's heart raced. "What do you mean, trap? How can I get out?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes distant. "The road changes. It feeds off those who wander too far. It doesn't let you leave. Ever. If you stop, it will take you. It's already watching you." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and her hand reached out as if she wanted to touch the side of his car, but she stopped herself. "You can't stop here. You can't let it catch you." Before Quinn could respond, she turned, her frail figure blending into the shadows like a ghost. He sat frozen for a moment, his heart pounding. What was that? Who was she? The words echoed in his mind. "It's already watching you." Quinn quickly rolled up the window, his hand shaking as he glanced around. There was no one else on the road, no sign of the woman, just the dark, oppressive landscape around him. He wasn't sure if he should follow her advice or if he was losing his grip on reality. His foot pressed on the gas again, and he pushed the thought of the woman from his mind. But the silence seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. Quinn's hands gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the woman. It was the way everything felt, like the world around him was holding its breath. Then, the shadows moved. Out of the corner of his eye, Quinn saw something darting between the trees, a figure, just out of focus, something too quick to fully see. It was as if something was tracking him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. His heart skipped a beat, and he forced himself to focus on the road ahead. He wasn't alone here. Something was following him. He tried to shake the thought, but it wouldn't leave him. It was there, lurking just behind him, invisible but ever present. He could feel it. A constant presence that made his skin crawl, like something was watching him from the shadows. It was the same feeling he had when he first saw the woman. The road. It wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. And there was something out there. Something he couldn't see, but could feel. Getting closer. Then, his mind screamed at him to stop. But he couldn't. He couldn't stop. The sign, the warning, Rule 1, never stop. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't let whatever was chasing him catch up. But the fear gnawed at him, growing stronger with every mile. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take the tension any longer, the road ahead seemed to shift. The trees, the shadows, they were wrong. They were bending, warping, changing before his eyes. The landscape was no longer the same. What had been a straight path now twisted into a sharp curve that shouldn't have been there. His headlights flickered, and he slammed on the brakes, his heart racing, his stomach churned with a sickening realization he had driven too far. Quinn pulled off to the side of the road, desperate to get a hold of himself. He needed to think. He needed a moment of clarity. He got out of the car, stepping onto the gravel shoulder. The cold air bit at his skin, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But as soon as he stepped out of the car, something shifted. The road beneath his feet didn't feel the same. The trees had grown closer, their branches reaching down, almost like hands trying to grab him. He turned to get back into the car, but when he looked, the car was gone. His heart leapt into his throat as he spun around, his breathing quick and shallow. The road had changed. The car wasn't where he left it. Panic flooded through him. He ran down the road, looking for his car, but the landscape had shifted, the world around him bending and twisting in impossible ways. The road wasn't just a place, it was alive, changing, warping around him, and it was playing tricks on his mind. The rules, the warnings, they were real, and now he was paying the price. The road had him, and there was no way out. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the same dark, oppressive atmosphere pressing in on Quinn as he drove. His hands were still shaking from the strange experience with his car, the way it had vanished when he'd stepped away from it. He couldn't understand what had happened, but the fear that had been gnawing at him now had a name: the road itself. It wasn't just an inanimate path, it was alive, and it was changing him. He drove on. The world around him felt like it was slipping out of focus. The trees seemed to sway, though there was no wind, and the road twisted in unnatural ways. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him. It only grew stronger with each mile. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, there. But there was nothing. Yet still, that unease remained, like something was lurking just out of sight, ready to pounce. Suddenly, he saw someone on the side of the road. Another figure, another stranger. Quinn's heart pounded as he slowed his car, trying to make sense of the man standing alone in the dark. He was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed too wide for his face, as though he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt. His eyes darted around nervously, constantly scanning the shadows. "Hey," Quinn called out, his voice shaking. "Are you all right?" The man's eyes locked onto Quinn's, and for a moment, he just stared. Then, his lips twitched into a strange, almost grim smile. "It's not safe," the man muttered. His voice was low, trembling. "You shouldn't be here." Quinn's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The road knows," the man said, his voice shaking with paranoia. "It knows your fears. It sees you, watches you, waits for you to slip up. It knows who you are. It'll make you see things that aren't real, and you'll start to believe it." His eyes grew wild as he spoke, his hands trembling. "I don't trust anyone anymore. Don't trust anyone you meet here. They're all here for a reason. It's too late to leave." The man didn't answer, his eyes shifting wildly. He seemed to be talking to himself now, his words turning into a jumble of fear and frustration. "It watches. It listens. It never stops. It's the road. The road's always hungry." "I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy," he repeated, shaking his head as though trying to shake off the thoughts that were chasing him. Quinn felt a chill run down his spine. The man's words echoed in his mind. Trust no one. Was the man warning him? Or was he just another lost soul driven mad by the road's twisted power? Before Quinn could ask any more questions, the man took a step back and turned, his eyes darting to the trees. "Get out of here," he said urgently, as though the very air was thick with danger. "It's coming. It's watching. You don't have much time." Quinn's hands gripped the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what was worse, the man's rambling warnings or the feeling that everything was slipping further out of his control. He slammed his foot on the accelerator and sped past the man, the darkness swallowing him whole as he left the stranger behind. The silence inside the car felt suffocating, and Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. It was a vague sensation, like being stalked by something unseen. He glanced nervously in the rearview mirror again, but there was no sign of the man. Still, that feeling of being watched never left. His gaze fell to the side of the road, where he saw another sign posted. It was the same twisted, crooked wooden post with a faded, crooked wooden sign nailed to it. This time, the words were clearer. "Rule number 2. Trust no one. They are here for a reason." Quinn's pulse quickened. Was the road trying to send him a message? What did it mean that they are here for a reason? And why had the stranger warned him not to trust anyone? The weight of the warning sat heavily on Quinn's chest, but it wasn't just the words. There was something deeper, something darker at play here. The air felt charged, as though something unseen was lurking just beyond the trees, watching, waiting for him to slip up. The paranoia that had started to creep into his mind now bloomed fully. Quinn couldn't trust anyone. The stranger had made that clear. But who was he supposed to trust? He was all alone on this twisted road, and the more he drove, the more he felt the shadows closing in. Even the landscape around him seemed to shift, like it was bending to the will of something he couldn't understand. He drove faster, desperately trying to push the feeling of unease away. But the darkness grew heavier with each passing mile. And then, as night fully descended, Quinn saw something that made his blood run cold. At first, he thought it was just a trick of his tired mind, but when he saw it again, he knew he was wrong. In the distance, just past the tree line, glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadows. They were faint at first, barely visible, but then they grew brighter, more intense. They weren't human eyes. They were something else, and they were watching him. Quinn's heart began to race. The creature that had been following him was no longer a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was getting closer. He floored the accelerator, desperate to outrun whatever was behind him, but it was no use. The creature was always there, just out of reach, its glowing eyes following his every move. The more he tried to shake it, the closer it got. And then, just as he thought he might escape, the road seemed to change again. The shadows around him thickened, closing in on the car like a suffocating fog. The creature's eyes were no longer just in the distance. They were right behind him, just beyond the edge of his vision, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, the car jerked to a halt. Quinn's breath caught in his throat. He tried to restart the engine, but it sputtered, refusing to cooperate. Panic flooded his chest. The creature was there, just outside the window, its eyes glowing brighter now, and it was moving closer. He could hear something in the darkness, something scraping against the ground, like claws on stone. Then he realized something. His fear was feeding it. The creature wasn't just following him, it was growing stronger the more terrified he became. He could feel it, feeding off the raw terror that gripped him, feeding off the fear that made him want to run. And there was no escaping it. If Quinn didn't understand the rules, if he didn't figure out how to stop the fear from consuming him, there would be no way out. The road, the creature, the endless darkness. They were all part of it, and Quinn was trapped, bound by the twisted, unyielding rules of this strange and terrifying place. The more he tried to escape, the stronger the beast became, its glowing eyes never leaving him, its hunger growing with every moment. The road was alive, and it was playing a game Quinn couldn't win. The road had become a nightmare. Quinn could feel it now, the heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to surround him. It wasn't just the fear, it was something deeper. Something that seemed to be coming from the very earth beneath the tires, twisting the air itself into something unnatural. Every mile felt longer than the last, as if the road was stretching endlessly, trapping him in a place that didn't belong on any map. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, and his stomach turned. There, standing just outside the reach of the light, was the creature, the hollowed one. Its grotesque, shifting form was closer than before, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. Quinn's heart thudded painfully in his chest, and his hand gripped the steering wheel tighter, the fear creeping up his throat. Suddenly, his eyes fell on another sign, one that appeared almost out of nowhere. A wooden post jutted out of the earth, with another rule written in jagged, uneven letters. Rule number 3, never look behind you. A chill ran down Quinn's spine. The words felt like a direct warning, a warning that carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The road had rules, but every time he ignored them, things only got worse. But then the thought gnawed at him. What if this was a trap? What if it wasn't just the creature that he was running from? What if, by following the rules, he was only making himself more vulnerable? He glanced back into the rearview mirror. The hollowed one wasn't there anymore, but it didn't matter. Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was about to happen. The air in the car felt thicker now, as if it was pressing in on him from all sides. Every corner of the dark road seemed to be closing in. As Quinn's mind raced, he saw a figure up ahead, another traveler. This one was older, with a grizzled face and a slow, steady gait. He had a weathered look, as though he'd been on the road for far too long. When Quinn slowed the car to a stop, the man didn't flinch, just stared at him with weary eyes. "Don't stop," the man said with a raspy voice. "The road's got you now. There's no turning back." Quinn's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" The man's eyes darkened. "I'm Cedric Thorne. Been stuck here for decades. Ain't nobody leaving this road. Not unless they know how to play its game." Quinn frowned, his mind spinning. "What do you mean? What's this road? What's going on?" Cedric's face twisted with a deep, pained expression. "You should have listened to the rules. I didn't, and now I'm part of it. The road. It's not just the road. It's controlled by something else. Something far worse than what you think." Quinn leaned forward, his voice trembling with urgency. "What is it? What's controlling the road?" Cedric took a long, shaky breath, as if he was considering whether to even tell Quinn the truth. "It's called the Veil Keeper," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "A half-human thing that traps souls like flies in a spider's web. It feeds off your fear, your pain, your desperation. Anyone who tries to break its rules becomes part of its collection. You think it's just the hollowed one following you? You haven't seen what really lurks in the shadows." Quinn's stomach churned, the weight of Cedric's words sinking in. The Veil Keeper. a creature that controlled everything here. Every soul that had fallen into this trap was its victim, and the longer he stayed, the more likely he was to become part of the road's twisted cycle. "You need to leave," Cedric whispered urgently, his voice low and frantic, "before it's too late. The road doesn't give second chances. Once you're in, it keeps you. Forever." Quinn's hands were clammy on the wheel. The tension in his chest had reached a breaking point. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore. But Cedric seemed different. He wasn't just some paranoid man lost on the road. He had the haunted look of someone who had learned the hard way what the road could do to a person. Cedric turned away from the car, his face drawn and hollow, like he had aged decades in just a few years. He muttered something under his breath, something Quinn couldn't hear, before walking off into the darkness. Quinn didn't have time to process the warning. The fear was too sharp. It pressed in on him, suffocating him with the weight of it. He needed to keep moving, but as he drove on, he felt a growing dread creeping into his bones, something he couldn't ignore. Every road sign now seemed like a cruel joke. He couldn't trust them, but they were the only guide he had. He drove faster, hoping to outrun whatever was stalking him. But the road stretched on, impossibly long, and the sense that the Veil Keeper was always watching him grew stronger. And then, another sign. Rule number 4. Don't look back. Not ever. Quinn froze. He had broken the third rule. He had looked behind him. The car suddenly jerked violently, throwing him against the seat. His heart leapt into his throat as the world around him seemed to spin. The road was warping again, twisting like a living thing. But worse than that, something was there, in the shadows. Something that was no longer hiding. The air felt thick with a sense of imminent danger. Quinn's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. He tried to push the accelerator, but it felt like the car was losing speed. No matter how hard he pressed the pedal, the engine sputtered, refusing to move fast enough. And then it stepped into the light. The Veil Keeper. Its massive, hulking form blocked the road ahead. Its face was grotesque. Half human, half something else. Its skin pale and cracked like old stone. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the dark. Quinn's breath caught in his throat as the creature's mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth, impossibly sharp and dripping with something foul. It took a step toward the car, and Quinn could feel the weight of its gaze bearing down on him. It spoke, its voice deep and booming, as if the ground itself trembled with every word. "You've broken my rules," the Veil Keeper growled. "Now, you will never leave." Quinn's heart raced as the reality of what Cedric had said hit him like a ton of bricks. The road had claimed him. He had become part of it, whether he liked it or not. There was no escape. The creature's grin widened, and Quinn knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The road had taken his soul, and now it was playing with him. With no rules left to break, he had nothing left but fear, and the Veil Keeper could taste it. Quinn's mind was racing as he drove deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The road, which had once seemed like an odd detour, now felt like a prison, a place where reality itself was distorted, where time and space no longer followed their natural order. The weight of the road's hold on him was suffocating, and every passing second seemed to stretch on forever. He felt his sanity fraying at the edges, the constant sense of being watched gnawing at him. As Quinn's eyes scanned the horizon, he saw another sign. It was almost exactly like the others, but this one was different. It felt colder, darker, as if it had been waiting for him all along. It read simply, "Rule number 4, if you try to leave, you will never be allowed to leave." A chill ran down his spine. The road had him now. He understood the truth, and it was worse than anything he had feared. The road wasn't just a place, it was a prison, and everyone who had ever stepped foot on it was trapped. He wasn't the first to fall into its grasp, and he wouldn't be the last. But what did it mean to leave? Could he ever leave? It wasn't until then that Quinn realized the true horror of the road. The rules weren't just warnings, they were traps. The more he tried to understand them, the more he was consumed by them. The road didn't care about the people who wandered through it. It cared about the fear, the torment, the endless cycle of souls lost in its grip. Quinn's heart pounded as he drove, not knowing where he was going or how much longer he could take the weight of the road pressing on him. It was then that the Veilkeeper appeared again. It was as if it had been waiting for this moment, its monstrous form stepping into the light, its eyes gleaming with that same sickly glow. Its voice was a low, guttural growl that echoed through the car like a death sentence. "You understand now?" The Veilkeeper's voice slithered through the air. "This is your home now, forever, but you have a choice." Quinn's blood ran cold. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The creature's grin stretched wider, more unsettling than ever. "You can stay here with me and become part of the endless cycle. The road needs you, just like it needed all the others. You will feed it like the rest." Or... The Veilkeeper's eyes narrowed, its voice turning darker. "You can try to escape, but understand this. If you run, if you break the rules, the road will consume you. It will tear you apart. You will be swallowed whole by the very thing that trapped you here." Quinn's mind spun as the Veilkeeper's words sank in. He didn't know what to do. The idea of becoming just another soul trapped on this cursed highway made his stomach churn. But could he truly escape? Or was the road already part of him, like a twisted parasite, gnawing away at his very soul? He didn't have time to think. Panic set in. Desperation surged through him, and before he even realized it, Quinn slammed the car into gear and sped off. He was running now, ignoring the rules, ignoring the warnings. He had to get out. He couldn't let the road take him, but the road wouldn't let him go. The signs that had once seemed like random warnings began to repeat, like a cruel mockery of his desperation. He saw the same signs, the same directions, the same messages, over and over again. It was like he was stuck in an endless loop. The road was shifting again, changing around him, making it impossible to escape. Each turn he took led him to the same place, the same stretch of road, the same hollow emptiness. The car's engine sputtered, and Quinn felt the air grow heavier with each passing second. His pulse raced as he slammed his foot on the pedal, but nothing changed. The road stretched on forever, as if mocking him, reminding him that there was no escape. The rules were clear. You could never leave. Then it happened. Out of the corner of his eye, Quinn saw something in the distance. It was a familiar sight, a sign, but this one was different. He could see his own face on it. His own face, staring back at him from the road. It was twisted, distorted, like he had been staring at it for far too long. But it wasn't just his face. The words beneath it sent a cold shiver down his spine. Rule number 5, don't stop. Quinn Ashford never left. His breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him hard. His face, his name, was now part of the road. He had become part of the rules, a new warning for anyone who dared to stop. He was no longer just a traveler. He had joined the road itself, trapped in its endless cycle of torment. Quinn's hands trembled as he looked up from the sign, but the road had already swallowed him. There was no escape. The more he looked ahead, the more he saw his face over and over again, trapped in the signs, in the warnings. He had become part of the highway, a new entity to torment others, to ensure they never left, just as he never would. And as the night closed in around him, Quinn's voice, though twisted, though hollow, echoed on the wind. Don't stop. You'll never leave. The road had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. The final choice had been made, but was it really his choice? Or had he already been lost the moment he stepped onto that cursed road? Has Quinn truly escaped, or is he now part of the road itself, doomed to watch as others make the same mistakes he did? The road waits, always waiting for the next soul to wander in, and the cycle continues.